I'm just going to go ahead and get started as people are making their way to their seats. My name is Mike Ruffino. I'm a graduate fellow for the Futures Initiative, and I'm also a doctoral student in the Human Development Program here in the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'd also like to welcome you to our event today, Measuring What Counts, Credentials or Learning, a discussion on metrics, assessment, equity, and finding ways to measure what we really value. I would also like to welcome those who are joining us via live stream, including Amal and Chain, a volunteer organization in London devoted to supporting gender equality through technology. Thanks for joining us. We would like to encourage joining in our Twitter chat, where we will be live tweeting using both the hashtags what counts and fight for EDU. That's fight for the number 4 EDU. Also, everyone is welcome to join in our Google Doc and contribute with comments, notes, and questions. And we'll try our best to ask those questions in the room. So for those of you who are not in the room with us, that is another way you can follow along with the discussion. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'll just tell you a bit about the Futures Initiative and about this series. The Futures Initiative is a program that got started in 2014, and its goals are to advance equity and innovation in higher education through student-centered teaching and learning, and to promote reinvestment in higher education as a public good. Today's discussion is the 6th in the series for the University Worth Fighting For, a year-long series of events that tie student-centered, engaged pedagogical practices to institutional change, diversity, equality, and social justice. I'd like to give you some announcements and upcoming events at the GC. The Futures Initiative is co-sponsoring 3 upcoming events, all in March. For one, there's the Modern Language Association is offering a workshop on publishing humanities research online using WordPress. Sarah Schumann will discuss her new novel, The Cosmopolitans, which has been published by the Feminist Press. The Intellectual Publics will host a conversation between Drs. Alondra Nelson and Dr. Jacqueline Brown. Also, the Graduate Center for Teaching and Learning will host its first Teach at CUNY Day on May 2nd. Students of the Graduate Center teaching their first college courses are strongly encouraged to attend. And for those of you who are interested in alternative forms of assessment, the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy has an upcoming issue which seeks to highlight innovative technological and pedagogical approaches to e-portfolios. The deadline to submit is May 15th. More information is available on the table in the back. So for today's discussion, we'll focus on the social and political implications of the ways we test, grade, measure, rank, and assess. We will look at ways our metrics can perpetuate racial, gender, and class inequality, and we will look at new alternative methods of assessment that offer more fluid, equitable, and holistic ways of evaluating and supporting learning at every level. Assessment is a core component surrounding education at all levels. The call for assessment and accountability has come from many angles, including outside academia. However, assessment comes with all sorts of tensions. For instance, assessment and accountability have been closely associated with standardized testing, which has been met with resistance. As Anya Kamenetz points out in her work, teachers, teaching unions, and parents have resisted standardized testing and other imposing assessment accountability practices since the early 20th century. And this is still the case at all levels of education today. Assessment has the danger of limiting a teacher's agency, and there is a lot of faculty resistance toward assessment that is imposed in a top-down fashion. This not only oppresses faculty, but also the students. Even former Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, who strongly supports accountability based on standardized testing, has acknowledged that testing, I quote, testing is sucking the oxygen out of the room in a lot of classrooms, end quote. But does assessment have to be this way and only way? What needs to be done is to problematize what we mean by assessment and how do we go about assessment. Lev Vygotsky, an early 20th century psychologist, said that if you want to assess a student, don't just assess what he can do today, but what he will be able to do tomorrow. In other words, Their ongoing process and potential of learning and development is just as significant as the product. With that in mind, can assessment be a developmental process rather than an oppressive chore that can empower students and faculty? I have had my fair share of testing. During my time as a student of LaGuardia Community College, I was required to pass a standardized exam to test out of my remedial courses to begin to take credit-bearing courses. The pressure to pass a test solely to demonstrate proficiency further exacerbated my view of learning as an alienating process that was reduced to rote skills and memorization. Thus, I ask, what types of assessment practices can promote deep and engaged learning? And lastly, but not least, how has our metrics perpetuate inequality considering race, gender, and class, both in education and in the less formal academic settings? I look forward to our speakers today because they have much to offer as leaders in pointing out and reframing accountability and assessment in more fluid, equitable, and holistic ways of evaluating and supporting learning. So, we are very delighted to welcome three renowned national speakers on the topic of assessment joining us today, and also in the order of presentation is Anya Kamenetz. She is an author of the widely acclaimed book, The Test, and a lead digital education reporter for NPR. Copies of the test will be available for purchase and signing following this event. We also have Brett Einen, who is an Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at LaGuardia Community College, CUNY, and a leader in the ePortfolio movement. And last but not least, we have Leah Gilman, who is a Vice President of Strategy and Innovation for Girls Who Code and former Director of Mozilla's Hive NYC Learning Network. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your expertise. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction and for sharing your personal reflections. I really appreciated that. Thanks for having me here. It's really a pleasure. I didn't set out to write a book about testing, but I have a question for you guys. How many of you can remember what you got on your SATs? Or possibly your GREs? Okay, so it's there, it's not completely there, but we all have lived lives in one way or another that are ruled by high stakes and standardized tests. And for those of us who have children in public schools or who are in any way concerned about our education system, you must be aware of the central focus that has emerged on high stakes standardized tests. That, since No Child Left Behind was passed into law with bipartisan support in 2002, every student in the land has been required to take annual tests of math and reading skills from grades 3 through 8, plus once in high school. And that these tests have had consequences at every level, not only for individual students, like grade promotion and tracking, but for teachers, teacher evaluation, very controversially, and for schools, consequences like reorganization and closing down the schools. So this has been a policy that has been massively unpopular. It's become something that has been disavowed even by its creators and supporters. President Obama has spoken out against unnecessary testing. The new education secretary has spoken out against unnecessary testing. And because there seems to have been a kind of mission creep around these tests. Most of the tests that students are taking in schools today are not the state-required tests that I just mentioned, but they are mostly district-administered tests for a panoply of purposes, around 23 distinct purposes, including diagnostic, benchmark, practice exams. So there's sort of just been this pile up of testing, and there's a test for every purpose. Where we all could kind of agree on the notion of having some fair or some central standard by which we, measure all students, and I think the initial support, especially from the left, for high-stakes standardized testing was that, this was something that was signed onto by the civil rights movement and championed by Ted Kennedy as a senator, because they believed that the inequalities that were, brought to the nation's attention, or they tried to end with Brown versus Board of Education, had not been ended, have not been ended, and that the inequalities of segregation and the inequalities of poverty among our students could somehow be addressed if they're brought to light. If we see over and over again that students are not being taught or not being learned the same, depending on their background or where they happen to be born, that therefore will be pushed to remedy it. That has not happened. Testing students has not led to greater equality. In fact, we've entrenched this notion of an achievement gap, and that learning is something that students can do if they try hard enough. So there's a lot of this could have been predicted, in fact was predicted. I said in my book, Campbell's Law in the 1970s. Donald Campbell, a multidisciplinary social scientist, wrote a paper, and he called out high-stakes educational testing. He said, achievement tests may well be valuable indicators of general school performance, general school achievement, under normal conditions. But when test scores become the goal of the teaching process, they both lose their value as indicators of educational status and distort the educational process in undesirable ways. So this is something that is was also phrased by another social scientist as Goodhart's law, which is when you make a measure into a target, it's no longer a good measure. So any target, any benchmark that you attempt to put high stakes on leads to all kinds of undesirable consequences. So what I came to believe was that in looking at our testing program in our public schools, there's two problems with the tests. One is that they're high stakes, and the second is that they're standardized. And the high stakes problem is really the biggest problem. The high stakes problem means that you're holding teachers accountable for their students' outcomes. You're holding schools accountable for their students' outcomes. Accountability sounds great. Everybody loves accountability. But there's a vast range of responses to that accountability. And that depends on things like the amount of pressure you put people under and what alternatives or what resources you give them to try to remedy the situation. And so you see something that's been called educational triage, where if you have a room full of students and they're distributed along a bell curve, and you're going to be graded based on the number of students who pass an arbitrary point drawn through the middle of the bell curve, where are you going to focus most of your attention? Not on the kids that are doing great, not on the kids that are doing really badly. It's on the kids that are just about to pass. So you have to focus all your attention on one portion of the kids within the class. And that has been documented in public schools in Texas and elsewhere. Coaching has been documented. Cheating has been documented. We had this incredible show trial in Atlanta with federal indictments for educational leaders for a vast kind of conspiracy of erasing parties and changing the scores on tests. But there's a lot of documentation of a lower grade level of cheating that goes on in classrooms nationwide when teachers are put under this kind of pressure. Teaching to the test, narrowing of the curriculum. There was a study that came out last year that showed that the percentage of kindergarten teachers who believe that their students should be reading by the end of kindergarten has gone from 31% just 15 years ago to 80% today. So we've turned our classrooms into very intensive academic places with very high academic expectations that are not seen as developmentally appropriate by many. So the way that we teach is distorted because of the imposition of these high stakes. But let's talk about the standardization problem for a second, right? This notion that there's a very large, and I get into in the story in the book about where does this notion of a bell curve come from? Our notion of intelligence as being fixed, hereditary, and unitary quality is something that's really a 19th century notion that is very, very tied to extremely problematic ideologies of eugenics. And it is, but that's one thing. It's problematic, but another really big issue with standardization is that it's not important anymore. What we're looking for in the 21st century are people who work well in teams, people who are creative, people who are innovative, and we're looking for a diversity of values and abilities within our organizations. And so how do you cultivate that within individuals? Testing itself is part of the instrument that imposes the mindset on children. If you do summative testing, if you do testing that has a very narrow scale, you are reinforcing the notion in children that what matters is a very narrow, intensive type of achievement. The standardized high-stakes tests we give to children are all individual. We never ask them to work in teams. We never ask them to generate multiple right answers to a problem. We never ask them to do anything creative or have any fun in standardized tests. So the way that we're testing is really shaping the curriculum, I think, in a lot of ways that many people see as out of sync and out of step. And I'm going to close by telling a story about how this might be changing and kind of the problems that that's bringing up, which is really kind of ironic and interesting. So you guys have all heard of the concept of grit, growth mindset, perseverance, non-cognitive skills, self-control. So many researchers for many decades, economists, psychologists, have gathered a lot of evidence showing that these qualities are just as important as academics in determining people's success in life. Their sense of self-efficacy, their ability to be empathetic and relate to others, and their ability to delay gratification and be organized and show up. There's a lot of evidence for this. These things are called social and emotional learning, or there's lots of different names for them. In the new federal education law, the updated No Child Left Behind, they did not get rid of annual tests, but they did do something to sort of lower the stakes, and that was something that a lot of people were excited about. Lowering the stakes meaning that there are not automatic consequences that arrive to states that don't reach an arbitrary level of proficiency. States have leeway to determine which schools they're going to focus on and what's their lowest performing schools. And states are being asked to create new accountability formulas that don't just rely on math and reading scores. Great, okay, let's look at a real broader range of indicators, right? And among those indicators include things like attendance and behavior and graduation rates, which are all kind of big picture, holistic views of school performance. And they're not relying on, grading or ranking individual students. So far, so good. Now we get to the tricky part. A group of districts in California, the big city districts, the core districts, has created a social and emotional learning curriculum based on self-control, self-efficacy, the qualities that we're talking about. And they have created a set of survey instruments, a test, that was given to upwards of 500,000 students as a field test last year. And in a few weeks, it's going to be given to California students as part of their accountability system. So there's going to be a high-stakes measurement of self-reported skills of social and emotional learning within classrooms. And this is a huge controversy. Okay, Angela Duckworth, who's a MacArthur Fellow who most associated with the concept of grit, was on the advisory board of the group that created these tests in California, and she just resigned because she said, I've been telling you guys for a while, and I issued a paper 5-6 months ago that said that these indicators are not ready for high stakes. The grit scale, the 12-item grit scale, which is a questionnaire that she created and has used with a lot of success as an experimental instrument, it's very predictive. But if you start to attach stakes to it and schools are going to have published scores, what's going to happen? How easy is it to tell a student what's the right answer on I always finish what I start? Agree or disagree? So this is I don't say this to damn. I think the people that are working on this stuff in California are working really hard. They're trying to push out information and curricula and material and help and support teachers. This is very hard. And when you start to bring the stakes back in, and also to try to create some standardized expectations around even these really important qualities, you kind of run into a train wreck. So that is going to be the end of my talk.
It's a treat to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for being here. I'm really honored to be on this panel. I think we have an interesting range of perspectives here. And I suggested that perhaps I follow Anya, because in some ways what LaGuardia is doing is an attempt to try to change the way that we do assessment so that we're not so reliant on tests. So if we maybe start with a notion of just a basic paradigm about assessment of learning is the way that a lot of the assessment that Anya is talking about is kind of driven by accountability, a focus on an external audience, and most often done through tests. Assessment for learning is a way of thinking about how do we use assessment to deepen the learning process, and to not only think about it as a learning process, deepening the learning of students, but also think about faculty, staff, and institutions as a whole. So LaGuardia has been, working on this in a number of ways. We have to do testing. I'm sorry, Mike, you had to do tests. The state mandates that we do tests, and there's no way that, we're already all in enough trouble with Mario Cuomo these days. But we've made a concerted effort over the past 15 years to develop an alternative system that models what we see as assessment for learning, and that's using our portfolio system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to go pretty fast to make sure that I give time for Leah. So I'm going to give a presentation here that I have done with my colleague, where did it go? Laura Gambino. From Gutman Community College in, a 45-minute version. So I threw out 80% of the slides. And if there's things that come up that you want to ask questions about, I'd be glad to talk about it. For example, one of the things that I'm not going to talk about is the ways in which we're trying to pioneer at this point what we might talk about as the next generation portfolio practice. Thinking about badging, thinking about analytics, thinking about a whole range of different forms of a portfolio. But I'm going to focus here on this question of assessment and assessment for learning. LaGuardia is about 20,000 credit students. We have about 12 to 15,000 students a year who are doing portfolios actively in one way or another. And it's used, in a variety of settings. We are, I guess I would say two things very quickly at the top. One is that ePortfolio, this is not a surprise in this audience, but in a lot of audiences, people think of portfolios as a technology, and they're not. They're a practice. They're a practice that engages students, faculty, staff. The technology is a part of it, but it's by far not the main thing. Secondly, that when we started our portfolio work, our real intention was to think about how we could deepen student learning and to help students develop a more purposeful identity as learners. And that's been the kind of driving force. So this is, one way to think about those 2 points, that the technology is only a small part, but what the technology supports is a practice that helps students connect their learning. And it's important that we understand that connection is taking place across courses and over time for exactly the kind of point that Anya was making about the importance of a process. That the portfolio allows us to do is think about and make visible the process of learning across disciplines, across semesters, and help students examine that themselves, share their understanding of their learning with other students, with faculty, and with external audiences. We've started now to build in advisors in that process. Mike actually was part of our peer mentoring program, working with other students and helping them develop more purposeful sense of themselves. What Mike talk about as purposeful self-authorship. So that's the pedagogy and practice of portfolios that sets up then what we do in terms of assessment. So as the portfolio makes learning visible, it provides an opportunity for students to examine their own learning and to assess their own learning and change and to think about how they're growing and changing and to move themselves forward. It also then fits into courses where faculty are reading and assessing student work, sometimes through the portfolio, sometimes not. There's lots of work that takes place outside the portfolio. But that kind of assessment is going on all the time. Then in our program review, all CUNY schools are required to do programmatic assessment, where you're looking at each major and assessing how well are we doing in supporting students. And in our case, the portfolio provides authentic artifacts of student learning that have become part of the assessment process where faculty assess their own programs, considering, where, what, how are we doing? We've set goals for ourselves, and are we accomplishing them? And finally, we do assessment at a college-wide level around our gen ed competencies, where we bring faculty together to read examples of student work and to weigh that against faculty-developed rubrics. So all this, what we're trying to accomplish is the notion of a learning college, the notion that we're all focused on building student learning, but we're all learning all the time how to do that. That that's a challenging process, and that we need ways of understanding what's happening with student learning in order to be able to deepen our craft and work together on that process. So if that's where assessment takes place, you might ask then the question of what are we assessing? And just very quickly here, for the sake of time, we've identified 3 common core competencies across the curriculum and 3 communication abilities. And I'd be happy to talk, and some of the folks here in the room have helped work on that. It was a group of faculty, staff, and students. We're still kind of fleshing this all out, exactly how to do it. But we've got these 3 competencies that are both embedded in our gen ed assessment, but also in our programmatic assessment. And they're assessed through using the artifacts of student learning. So the 3 competencies are inquiry and problem solving, global learning, and integrative learning. So in each case, we're looking for the combination of how we do this in classrooms, across classrooms, and in co-curricular settings. Mike's giving me a sign here, so I'll try and wrap up. In terms of the assessment then, I think that the portfolio is important in that it provides the artifacts to that process. So, and by grounding assessment in the real artifacts of student learning that come out of the work of students and faculty, it makes it more possible for faculty to think about how can we improve things. If the assessment is a test that has nothing to do with what's going on in the classroom, then it doesn't really help us think about how to improve things. But if the assessment is grounded in what we've chosen to value and the work that we're doing with students, then that allows us to think, oh, well, that's helping us this far, but how could we go further? Oh, you're doing it this way. Oh, that's helpful. That'll help me rethink. So this is a framework that, I'll just, end on this. This is a framework for thinking about how the portfolio and a series of institutional practices helps to deepen that work of a learning college. And those of you in the room that were from LaGuardia know we've been going through this whole process of engaging hundreds of faculty in the conversation of what our competencies should be. How do we translate that into the classroom? What does that mean in terms of the assignments that we do? And then how do we use the evidence to actually turn around and make change that improves student learning? So I'll be happy to chat more about this, but I'll turn things over to Leah.
Sure. Since I'm here kind of representing the informal learning space, I'm going to take advantage of that perspective to avoid the podium. My days of lecturing from a podium are long gone. But just by way of introduction, I did want to talk a little bit about about sort of how I come to this work. And I very much identify as a creative professional. My background is in film theory and semiotics and all kinds of things that help me to see things from a kind of a broad systemic perspective. But one thing that I always really value is this sort of tension between what kids learn in the sort of formal, in their sort of formal spaces, and then all the other things that inform their world and their life that also really help them understand the world around them. So for me, even though the majority of my teaching was done on a university level, I've always really been fascinated by the out-of-school space. And as someone who was a really, early adopter of technology and who, learned from other people and taught myself, I think the informal space has always been really interesting to me because it has this different focus. So, while my panelists here are very much talking about sort of standards and things that are required by the state, I wish, every kid was required to participate in a really, interactive, technology-focused after-school program. I wish I could create a law that said that, but that's not quite the where we are right now. But I do think the thing that's really important when we think about assessment and learning is this idea of measuring what counts and trying to find ways that are authentic and meaningful that take into account this kind of the diversity of experiences that the youth that we work with have. So I really think of learning as being something that is socially constructed, something that happens within a social context, and something that can happen anywhere. And I think when you begin to think about how technology has a role in this larger conversation, and you think about a very digitally sort of connected world, I think people talk about learning that's anytime and anywhere. I actually think that brings up too many really difficult political issues about who has access to what technology. So I don't love this idea of learning anytime, anywhere, but I do really think that we want to value the kinds of learning that happens in the out-of-school space and the in-school space and in all of the different places that kids inhabit. So I really like to think about learning as being sort of part of an ecosystem. And what I love about the conversation today is just this focus. You had a great term. I wrote it down. Sorry. Anya, you said, you talked about this idea of lowered stakes, and you also talked about cultivation. And I thought those were two really important ideas. So one is very much the beauty of the out-of-school space in some ways is that the stakes, albeit seem a lot lower, right? And I did have a really interesting experience of helping to participate in a team that designed a new school. And it was really interesting to be grounded in both the design of the school and then be really focused on on creating rich experiences that would happen after the school day. So I worked at the Institute of Play for several years. We designed a new game-based learning school, Quest to Learn, and so I was very involved in the design of the school and the school day, but then at the same time, as the school opened, I sort of started focusing on what happens after school. And I would always see this interesting thing happen, which is that the teachers who were aware of the kids who were successful during the school day were aware of one kind of student, and then the kinds of facilitators and educators and teachers that were active in the after school day also had a kind of a different idea of a successful student. And very rarely would the student who was successful during the school day be the same student that was successful in that after school space. And when you begin to think about how we connect these spaces, something like a portfolio becomes a really interesting idea, right? Where you think about where's that one common repository where all of the kinds of things that a kid is doing, and I loved your use of the term artifacts, that's always so important. Like all of the things that a kid may be doing or involved in during the day, those artifacts are collected in one place. So this is where my years at the Mozilla Foundation and this focus on open source technologies and thinking about transparency really comes out, because you want to think about it. You want to think about who's owning this information, and who is contributing to that information, and who's actually building that portfolio. So I like to really think about that as actually being something that's student focused, and that is something that if it's not, maybe it is begun by a professor, or maybe a college begins that portfolio, but that portfolio is actually the thing that the student has to own. They have to understand what it is they're learning, and they have to be really aware of what they're putting in that portfolio and what it represents about who they care about, what they care about, and what they know how to do. And so increasingly, I think we all know when we talk about these 21st century skills and what's important, it is the artifact. When you're hiring a coder, you want to see what they've worked on. You want to know what programming languages they know, and you want to see what they've developed. Does it work? So the idea that assessment can be built in, I think, has always been really important to me. And I think what draws me to code and what draws me to games and technology and other areas that I've really worked in is this idea that the assessment can be built in. So if I design a game, particularly a digital game, and it's broken and it doesn't work, we know that there's something faulty there, right? Somehow I haven't gotten something along the way. And so, that to me, in many ways, is really what we begin to think about when we think about how you measure what counts, right? So you can use testing to measure particular outcomes, of course. But I like to think about this idea of really valuing what is important to kids, creating a number of different types of contexts in which they can learn and show what's of interest to them. And then also really thinking about, the other thing that the informal space really does well is it does this sort of, kind of dynamic difficulty adjustment, right? You have kids there who may be interested in one area, but they actually may have varying levels of experience. Rarely do you, in the informal space particularly, say, if you haven't taken this class, you can't come in the door. It's a little bit more open there. So I think there's also this way in which you want to be able to adjust to the kinds of things that kids are interested in and somehow be able to reflect that work. Mm-hmm. So these are very broad statements and thoughts, and I'll just kind of wrap up in some way. But I think one of the things that, just to talk a little bit more specifically about the kind of work that I'm doing now, one of the things that really drew me to Girls Who Code as an organization is that they are working in the informal learning space. We do an immersive summer program with a focus on computer science and really a larger focus on computational thinking, which is really based in having girls do creative problem solving and work in teams to really solve problems. So they start out working in Scratch and then they may be working in Python, but they're actually doing sort of creative application of a wide range of skills. But the ultimate goal is to increase the number of majors in College of Computer Science. And this to me is like this really important dovetailing, right? It's looking at the informal space as a unique place that can provide a different skill set and use a different approach. So it's a very gender inclusive approach. The idea is that you not only are teaching girls, about CS, but you're doing that within the context of this larger network of girls. There are girls around them. There are women who are coming in. There are people who are talking about the role of women in the larger technology space and giving them this larger sort of sense of exposure. And then also building this network of other girls that they're seeing, of other mentors, and encouraging people that are helping them to see what they can do with these kinds of skills out in the world. Now, obviously, there are a lot of formal institutions that do this kind of work very well. Historically, Black colleges do an amazing job of this, right? Creating a network, helping people understand the sort of specific history and the social space of where they're learning. But for me, what's really interesting is to try to approach this sort of larger pipeline issue as essentially kind of an innovation problem, right? Saying if we don't encourage, really specific populations who are not widely participating in the work that we're doing now, so communities of color, just to kind of broaden it beyond gender. You ultimately have this sort of dearth of information and knowledge and products and ideas that end up being out in the world. But at the same time, our pipeline and our focus is really looking towards the higher education experience as being a key part of this larger puzzle. And I think anyone who has been awake for the past 3 years has sort of like read every story about all the great entrepreneurs that go off to Silicon Valley and make $1 million. But the real sort of story, obviously, is that you actually have to fail 3 or 4 times before you kind of hit and find your stride. And while I think that kind of resiliency and grit can be really important, I don't think that is for everyone. And when we talk about technology, when we talk about computer science very specifically, I think there are a range of different ways that you can potentially go. And there are a range of different things that you can do. And for me, really trying to encourage young women to think about what the range of potential ways that they can apply what they've learned is that sort of extra piece that the college education really gives you. It's not that you can't learn that in other places, but I do think having that time to not just learn, but to begin to accumulate your knowledge and focus within particular areas of expertise becomes really important. So I kind of love to sort of see how these different areas that we're talking about really kind of come together. And yeah, those are my very broad thoughts right now.
Questions, thank you, panelists. It was amazing, very stimulating remarks. Do we have questions for the panelists? Comments, questions? Tina?
So we've got a really vibrant discussion that's happening on Twitter right now as well, and one question that someone has asked online is, given all of the things that you've brought up here, what might be some approaches to a more wider framework of testing, particularly in traditionally narrow subjects like natural sciences or mathematics, where you do have a lot of those very specific and high-stakes testing environments?
So one approach I talk about in the book is performance-based assessment. And there's it's sort of intermediary between portfolio and standardization, because you create a performance task with a rubric, and in the case of science and mathematics, it involves, for example, designing an experiment in a particular discipline, and you have to use certain math concepts in order to report out your results and to find out if they're significant. And so I talked to a student, or I visited a school that was doing this for the 7th and 8th grades in a middle school in Kentucky. And what was really amazing to me about it was, first of all, it was bringing the science back into science, because the students had to design experiments where they really didn't know what the outcomes were going to be. They had to understand what independent and dependent variable was. Plus, they had to choose topics that were appealed to them as individuals, and that's something that we don't pay a lot of attention to in science and mathematics. So the notion of bringing back interest-driven learning and creating interdisciplinary challenges, and also I think bringing in group challenges. That's another thing that you have lab partners, but in mathematics in particular, there's a real dearth of sort of group problem solving, I think, at least in the way that we assess math. So again, I think the what's going to motivate the school systems to move in that direction is a call, I think, from industry to say this is the kind of problem-solving skills that we want from students and the kinds of things we need them to be able to demonstrate.
I guess I would just say I think that that's very consistent with what we're doing in terms of portfolios, and that in our STEM areas, faculty use a range of methods in terms of their internal, they're kind of grading their courses. But as a system, as a college, we're really focused on these artifacts that come out of a whole range of activities, just like the ones you're talking about. Yeah. So faculty designing inquiry processes where students are engaging with authentic problems, and then generating results and presenting that, and then also reflecting on what did they get out of the process.
Right.
And so that becomes, in terms of what we think about as whether we're looking at a particular program or the college as a whole, those are the things that we're valuing most. So, and I think that's entirely possible. It does take a commitment on an institutional level to do that beyond a single classroom.
Yeah.
The other thing I would just to pick up on some of what Leah said, it's been part of our interest, the notion about the informal learning. It's been part of our interest in the last 3 or 4 years, is how can we make a stronger connection between what's happening in the classroom and what happens outside? Because I absolutely agree with you that that's part of what's, if we don't make those connections, then we really confine learning. You know, when students start to think they're only learning in this one space, but I think when we make the connections like you're talking about, I think it really is transformative.
You have a question, during
Yes. So very interesting presentations. Thank you to all. Regarding the high-stake testing and so on, great work by Doc Worth, wonderful additions of emotional intelligence. Yet I think what we have here is this lack of interest also in broader theories or philosophies of learning, because even when we want to add emotion to cognition, this is the 19th century view of what learning and development are. So we are at best dealing with William James, maybe John Dewey at best, but this is 19th, this is not even 20th century approaches. So, but there is a lack of interest in theories and philosophies, because I think it's the same with the zeitgeist of evidence-based, data-driven, so high-stake testing, and even those who challenge them, they're still mired in this belief that, oh, we're done with theory, we don't need theory. We need theory, and there are really interesting developments, such as situated learning, collaborative learning, embodied learning, and even approaches, of course, that merge them together, especially.
Yeah.
And they really step beyond this view of that we have cognition, we also have emotion, and we just add them up. And greed is a wonderful notion, but it also needs to be expanded. Like I think what you went. So we need new models of who are human beings, who our students are in our changing world. We need a new philosophy for that. And there are those things, but we need to pay attention to them. So to look for those things, you know, in a more proactive way.
Yes.
It's true that I came in the way that I'm always aware of the problematic. And what I'm wondering is, if testing is part of the problem, isn't it part of the solution also? Because I don't think testing is the devil, you know, it's the way you use it. We all know about formative assessment, and you know, I think, and sometimes even in summative assessment, testing is useful because we have an issue of agency that we're not taking into account in the problem. Because, you know, there's a lot of bluff in education nowadays, you know, and in all kinds of approaches, you know, kids, students, even professors don't want to do their work. You know, they don't want the headache, you know. We want to end up the class quick, everybody's happy. You know what I'm saying? You don't have to, people write all kinds of papers, they come up with all kinds of projects, you know, and, you know, testing gives you an opportunity to relatively evaluate people. Now, when you abuse it, then there is a problem, you know, and when it's not part of a...
if you have a question.
I'm finishing.
Can testing be a solution as well as a problem?
Yeah, you know,
So in the end of...
It's got to be part of a comprehensive approach, that's what I'm saying.
So in the end of my book, I talk about different approaches to sort of solve the problem with more of the same, more applications, better testing, essentially. And you know, one effort I talk about is within the Institute of Play, Glass Lab, where they brought to the table game designers, testing experts, learning people interested in learning, and they said, can we create games that gather evidence of higher order thinking skills while the student's playing? And the thing that's so interesting about the kind of assessment that's embedded in a game is that it doesn't just gather, it doesn't conceive of the student's knowledge state as something that's static at a point in time, but it's something that evolves through multiple playings of the game. And the kinds of data that's drawn, I'm really interested in this kind of notion of like quiet behavioral background data, that you could get information not just about like how much does the student know about X topic, but it's how hard are they trying right now? Are they paying attention right now? Are they easily distracted? Do they get, are they good at challenges, bad at challenges? And there's a real world application of this. I just, really quickly, this is great. Dartmouth undergraduates, they created a smartphone app that picked up the student's location and whether the phone's on or off and what's the background noise, the microphone picking up ambient noise. So they're tracking the students, and they find through the semester, they can map the campus so they know, are you at a frat house, are you at a coffee shop, are you at a library, are you at a classroom, are you in your own room? And they could see through the patterns of behavior, they could predict the students' grades. They could pick their GPAs within half a grade by midterm and by 95% by the end. It's like you wouldn't even have to grade these kids because you know where they've been, you know how well they're going to do at the end of the semester. And You know, and it's very fascinating stuff, right? But here's what's most fascinating. Like, there's kids that never go out, and there's kids that are huge social butterflies, and some of them, like, in both categories, get A's. But the kids who do well, they showed a drop in partying after the midterm. So they had the ability to delay gratification and study more. So whether or not they went out 4 times a week and then they went down to 3, or whether they went out once a week and went down to not going out, it was the pattern that really was most important. So should that be a high-stakes assessment? I don't know, but is it an interesting kind of way of assessing people? I think so. And it offers formative feedback. You could say, like, hey, you need to start studying more.
I think that's part of the line here, is what are we using this for?
Yes.
You know, and if it becomes a high-stake test, then I think it's actually kind of scary. But if it's something that, how do we support these students?
Who has access to the data? Are these bunnies that you're going to drown? Or is it something, I don't know if you guys heard about the controversy, but like, or is it something that students have control over, or maybe with their advisor it's confidential?
Exactly.
You have a question?
Yeah, I was just, so I work at Avenues,
Yeah.
which is setting up new schools, but I live primarily in Beijing, and I also do research on higher education, especially in China. So I'm really interested in these intersections of systems. And I was really struck by your idea that we don't need standardization. And one thing with those sort of intersections is that standardization seems to be really important. If you have a student whose parents move and is going to a new school, how do you know where they are, what sort of classes they should be in? And then applying to college, there's a similar thing of who do you accept? Most colleges don't accept anyone who applies, and so how do you evaluate that, especially across cultures? I mean, there's more and more students coming from overseas. And so I'm curious, all of your 3 different perspectives, if you see it as possible to actually get rid of standardization and have something like portfolios across the board as a cohesive system, or if there's going to be different, some standardized evaluations and then some portfolio, or just systematically how it's going to work to enable individual transfer across countries and institutions.
I mean, I would make one distinction between the difference between standards, right, which are rules that enable you to, I mean, if there wasn't an email standard, you would send me an email, I couldn't open it up, I wouldn't know what it was, right? So a standard and standardization, those might be 2 interesting distinctions to make, which is what can we kind of agree upon are those required rules that we need in order to make a particular decision, and then what are the different ways that people might actually reach that end. So that's my
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and standard is a very interesting word, actually. If you go back to the etymology of how it emerges, I would come at it maybe from a slightly different angle. I think that one of the things that we've been pursuing is not a standardization of courses, but how can we work together? How can, if we have a broad conversation about what do we really value in the educational experience, how can we work together across different kinds of boundaries so that it's not totally fragmented, so that there's some sense of students, developmental growth over time, and that we're all supporting that, whether it's advisors, student life, staff, faculty in one discipline, faculty in another discipline. How can we have a common conversation? So that's different than saying everybody's going to do standardized approach, but it gives us, within an institution, maybe across, some chance to talk about what are we doing or why are we doing it.
So basic standards for interoperability, yes, in a technological way. The more data we have access to, I would argue the less useful averages are, because we have the ability to actually prototype for individuals. And a specific example of this in the context you're talking about, I recently did a story on the growth of video-based admissions platforms, and this is for the very purpose of they're automated platforms where you get a video prompt and then the light blinks on and there's a camera and you have to talk for 2 minutes. And what is the main purpose of this? The main purpose of this is when colleges that are accepting so many students from China, they have the SAT scores, they have the TOEFL scores, and they have the essays, but they get here and they can't speak English. So this is what they've devised, and they're actually throwing the manpower at individual answers to individual questions in order to make sure that the students meet the standard.
Thank you.
One more. Okay, one more question.
Hi, I'm working on a dissertation on the visual dynamics of teacher evaluation, and so I'm thinking about this really from the teacher's perspective. And I guess one of the things that I learned in working with a group of teachers who were grappling with a really new kind of assessment in K-12 is about all of the parts of their work that aren't being measured. And it's really the informal learning that's happening within a formal setting. And so thinking about the invisible work that teachers do, which is highly gendered, you know, the kind of cleaning and physical labor that they do, and especially the kind of emotional work, the love labor, the caring, nurturing work that isn't being measured. And so I think I'm really excited by the ideas around portfolios and artifacts and looking visually, but I also wonder about what isn't seen, and how any of you are thinking about those harder to measure, harder to make visual aspects of student learning or teaching.
So I think a very basic way to get at this problem is the oft-repeated slogan, our working conditions are our students' learning conditions. And so when schools, for example, so with the spread of universal pre-K, states are faced with the issue of how do we license a pre-K. We don't have standardized tests for 4-year-olds. We're starting to, but that's not going to be the main way, hope to God, that we decide what's a licensed pre-K. And so they actually do have to do a very basic understanding of the social and emotional environment and the ecosystem within a classroom. And while I think that survey data is not the best way to do that, if you triangulate multiple pieces of information, and one of the most important one turns out to be is the training, background support, and working hours of the teachers. So what is their working environment? And a corollary to that is what's their turnover rate, right? What's their seniority? How much do they stay in the classroom? And so as we start to look and care more deeply about what might be going on invisibly in our students' learning and their development, I think paying attention to these factors, and the UN actually with the Millennium Development Goals, or Sustainable Development Goals, is engaging in this notion of figuring out, the goal of the last 15 years was universal primary education. The goal of the next 15 years is sustainable education, which is in a classroom that students are have access to a breadth of learning opportunities and have the option to engage in good relationships between teachers and students. So there's a lot of minds on this problem, I guess.
Well, I think we're running out of time, so I'll just say very quickly that we don't evaluate our teachers around this process. It's not a teacher evaluation process. And I absolutely agree with you about the complexity of what's going on in the teaching relationship. And what our focus on that front is how do we support teachers, bring faculty together to support each other in, kind of communities of learners who are focused on their practice, and how can we do that well without, creating, huge amounts of extra work. So that's it's not a measurement, but it's like, okay, we try to take that very seriously. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I have seen some pilots and some models of examples in which the portfolio really takes on so many different formats, and kids have a really active role in documenting their work, and yes, there is some labor involved in maybe sort of getting it set up, but usually, quite honestly, the sort of sophistication of the kids begins to outweigh the teacher at a certain point when it comes to just sort of like uploading stuff and documenting stuff and kind of keeping track of that kind of information. But I have actually seen lots of interesting collaborative work in that area. Where the portfolio is seen as a learning tool, and as a result, sort of it's an active process. It's not just the teacher documenting what the student is doing, but the student is also actively adding to the portfolio, thinking about what they're learning, and then filtering that information so that to have a portfolio that's a little bit more about demonstrating what has been learned. So.
Thank you all. By the way, for all of you who are here or joining us online, we'd like to encourage this discussion on Twitter. And please join us for our next event, April 14th, which is titled Teaching as Social Justice. We'll be exploring ways that equity, diversity, and race are core components to teaching as social justice. Thank you again.
And I'm signing books. You can look at.
It was lovely.